Hi, today we're going to be reading Chapter 3 from Heart and Soul. Chapter 3 is titled Abolition. Abolition comes from the word abolish. Abolish means to stop or get rid of something. Shun is the action of doing something, so abolition is the action of stopping or getting rid of something. And we have our picture here, which is this really great picture. You see this woman and she's sitting like, it looks like on a cloud, but it's on tons of cotton, okay? The quotes for today said, "That which is not just is not law." William Lloyd Garrison, abolitionist. There's actually a second quote. It says, "I expose slavery in this country because to expose it is to kill it." Frederick Douglass, abolitionist. And Frederick Douglass actually, hold on a second. He said to expose slavery is to kill it. Okay, he was an escaped slave, a former slave, and he went around speaking to people. I can't remember if we already talked about this. Speaking to people about slavery after he escaped, hoping that if he could educate them on how bad it was, they would do something to stop it. And so he wrote his story down in a book, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. So it tells his story from slavery to freedom, hoping that would help end slavery. All right. Even though it didn't specifically say so, slavery was written into the new Constitution right along with "we the people." The framers who wrote the Constitution could have ended slavery right then and there if they wanted to, and they even thought about it, but instead they chose to keep it. They thought they needed it. So after the colonists fought in the American Revolution, they had to make their own government. The Constitution is the rules for this new government, and in the Constitution, they allowed slavery to continue. You see, America grew up on slavery. It was like mother's milk to the new country, and it made her grow big and strong. Southern planters had lined their pockets with profits from slave-grown crops, and northern industries depended on them too. To justify slavery, Southern white folks had convinced themselves that black people were fine with being slaves. So if you justify something, that means you try to find reasons to convince yourself that it's right. So one of the ways that they kind of dealt with slavery is they justified it by convincing themselves and trying to convince others that Africans had no problem being slaves. They didn't mind. We were convinced that they were all nuts, or as we would say, touched in the head. Not a one of them would have traded places with us, and since those white gentlemen running the country wouldn't give us our freedom, we decided to take it ourselves. One of the slaves on Pap's plantation had taught himself to read, which was very dangerous, because if white folks had found out, he would have got a sound licking. White folks thought that if slaves learned to read or write, they could read the Bible for themselves or anti-slavery papers. Anti means against. So they didn't want them to read papers that were against slavery. So they could read the Bible for themselves or anti-slavery papers if they got their hands on them and begin to question their master's behavior. They might also be able to communicate with other slaves and anti-slavery folks outside the plantations. Education's power, guys. Education is a powerful thing and often makes slaves hard to control and likely to run away. So their masters took good care to make sure they remained illiterate. And illiterate means you can't read or write. In fact, at the time it was illegal for slaves to read and write. A lot of them learned anyway. They'd trick their young masters into teaching them the alphabet or find a spelling book and sneak off to learn it and then teach the other slaves. As it turns out, white folks were right about slaves who learned to read. The boy from Pap's plantation eventually ran away to Massachusetts, where he became a great speaker, talking to large crowds of white folks about how terrible it was to be a slave. He also wrote a narrative about his life that made him very famous. Many came to know him as the Lion of Anacostia. Pap knew him as Frederick Douglass, and that's who this is a picture of. And that's the book I showed you. Up north, Douglass joined with other free black folks, former slaves, and good white folks who were trying to end slavery. They were called abolitionists because they wanted to abolish slavery. Abolitionists were everywhere, even in the South. They worked with folks like Harriet Tubman to help slaves escape to the north by way of the Underground Railroad. Not a real railroad, but a loose network of safe houses and secret routes. Preaching about the awfulness of slavery was one of the best ways to fight it, and Douglass and Tubman did their best to spread the gospel. They lit a fire inside many a slave to take their freedom. But it was a hard row to hoe. Even though slavery was dying out up north, it was getting stronger down south. Cotton was the most profitable crop in the country, and plenty of slaves were needed to grow it. To meet the demand for more cotton, tens of thousands of slaves in northern slave states were marched hundreds of miles on foot out west and down the Mississippi River into the deep south. Pap remembered seeing a group of them tied together like horses to a wagon, marching down the road past his plantation. So, after the Revolutionary War, a lot of northern states decided to end slavery. Some of them did it right away. Some of them did it over a few years. First, they would let these people be free, and then these people, and then these people. The freeing of slaves is called emancipation. Massachusetts was actually the first state to emancipate or to free their slaves, but they were the first colony to make slavery illegal. New states were being added all the time as Americans started settling the West. Congress would determine whether or not each new state should allow slavery, and it was always a fight. As the country grew in size, so did the tension between North and South. Then, in 1854, Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which left it up to the settlers of new territories to decide whether or not to allow slavery. So a territory is an area owned by the United States or another country that is not a state yet. So the people are moving out there, but you have to have a certain amount of them in order to set up a government, and then each state has to have a constitution, and then they can be made part of the United States. So in these new areas, what they decided to do is said, well, we'll let the people living there decide if they want slavery or not. But the problem with that is it caused a ton of fighting between the people who were living there. People who wanted slavery and people who didn't want slavery. And some of the people who didn't want slavery just didn't want slavery because they didn't want Africans doing for free what they could get paid to do. So it caused lots of fighting in Kansas, Nebraska. It was called even Bloody Kansas. Actual people were dying, settlers fighting each other over whether or not they should allow slavery in those areas. The new law allowed slavery to exist above the Mason-Dixon line, a symbolic divided line between North and South at the border of Maryland and Pennsylvania, which was drawn 34 years prior during the Missouri Compromise. So what happened a long time ago is they tried to keep a balance in the United States of these states will be slave and these states will be free, and here's the line. Anything below that line can be a slave state. Anything above that line will be a free state. It's called the Missouri Compromise. That's also when Maine became a state, because to keep the same number of slave states and free states, they separated Maine from Massachusetts and made it a state. But then, instead of following that law, they decided to let people in the territories decide if they wanted slavery or not, which caused more problems. This scared the pants off of anti-slavery folks because the compromise made it so that slavery would be limited to the South. But now slavery seemed to be on the move. It put a fire in the bellies of abolitionist folks all over the Union, including a country lawyer named Abraham Lincoln. Because of it, that fellow decided to run for president. Southern white folks couldn't stand Lincoln. He had often spoken out against the spread of slavery, and Southerners were convinced that if he were elected president, it would spell the end of their way of life. It's no wonder why slaves and free black folks took an instant liking to the country lawyer. In him, they saw a chance to put an end to slavery for good. The truth, though, was Lincoln didn't have any intentions of abolishing slavery and very publicly said as much, but Southerners didn't believe him. So Lincoln's going to go on to be the president who freed the slaves, but just like everybody else, ideas change over time. And so when he first decided to run for office, he was against the spread of slavery. And then over time, as he got older, as he became president, his ideas began to kind of change, which actually, if you think about it, makes a person good, a good person, if they can listen to things and change their ideas instead of being stuck with the same idea their whole life. So it's good to have the ability to be able to change your thoughts about something. Slaves on Pabst's plantation were following the election closely, eavesdropping on white folks in the streets and at the dinner table. Election day came and went. Lincoln didn't get a single vote in the South, but won the election anyway by winning the popular vote in all but one of the northern states. White folks in the South were spittin' mad, so riled up that 7 southern states quit the Union, followed by 4 others not long after. The states formed their own country, the Confederate States of America, and elected Jefferson Davis their president. President Lincoln demanded they stop all of the foolishness and come back to the Union, but they didn't pay him any mind. The South was fixing for a fight, and so Lincoln gave it to them. So this is the start of the Civil War, which I'll talk a little bit more when we do the next chapter. But the Union is the word that you're going to hear used for the North, for the states in the North, so the United States. And then the southern states separated from the United States and formed their own country. And they called themselves the Confederate States. So that's the South. Okay? The North also called them rebels because they didn't think they had the right to separate. And the South would call the North Yankees, which is a term you still hear today.